Moving into the finale, Group 7, please come on down.
We're Team 7, so we focused on decarbonization and climate resilience funding for disadvantaged communities in the United States. And here's a roadmap. We're going to just talk a little bit about our team, our client, problem assessment. We'll go through our methodology and then talk about our deliverables and their hopeful impact, and a little bit of impact that we actually were able to measure. So here's our team. We're all here. We represent law school, policy, C's, and Ross, and public health. So our partner is Lawyers for Good Government. Lawyers for Good Government is a nonprofit organization of mostly lawyers, and they essentially have a lot of pro bono hours that they get from corporate lawyers. And we were sort of a novel group to work with them because our position was essentially like providing pro bono hours to them, but we were a concentrated group of students with a concentrated group of hours, which is not something that they usually get to work with. So it was exciting for them to have, instead of just a weekend of a lawyer's time, to have a team to work with them over the course of a year. So Lawyers for Good Government works in a lot of different areas, and their climate change and environmental justice program is the specific programming group we were working with. And so you can see here, they make a difference across many different areas of environmental issues, environmental justice issues. And so that was sort of the nexus of the issues that we were working with them on. So in terms of the issue that we were trying to address, there are right now these federal pieces of legislation that are providing a huge amount of money and funding that are supposed to trickle down. I don't mean to talk about trickle down economics. That is not the point of this. But they are getting specifically distributed, in fact, to communities that in many cases have never had access to this federal funding or federal funding of this type before. So primarily Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, those are providing billions of dollars of funding that are going to a lot of different areas, but a lot of it is for specifically climate resilience. But there are a lot of barriers in getting this funding to disadvantaged communities. So disadvantaged communities we're going to use as just a broad term, but there are specific definitions for this. And the important thing to note is that disadvantaged communities in the US have never, in many cases, had access to federal funding of this type. So still, there are barriers, even though in the legislation it says this needs to go to disadvantaged communities. So there are complex application processes for a lot of these funding opportunities. There's significant information gaps where, because a lot of these communities have never had access to this type of funding before, there's really not much infrastructure or information out there that helps them to understand how they can access it. And the funding landscape is incredibly dynamic. So it's constantly changing throughout the course of our project. There were funding opportunities that popped up and then disappeared within the year, often funding.
Okay, so we saw our project as having had like kind of 5 phases. So first was the research. We wanted to understand more about the IRA and the BIL that Jared mentioned and the other federal programs. And we also wanted to do kind of a comprehensive search of the resources that are already out there to help people understand how to apply and the application processes, because there is already a lot of information out there about how to do it. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and we also wanted to compile that information into one place, which now all that information lives on L4GG's website, so people can access it. The second phase was in the disadvantaged communities analysis. So as Jared mentioned, a lot of this funding is specifically earmarked towards disadvantaged communities. And so L4GG, as part of its funding clinic, they help communities apply for federal funding. They help 5 communities per quarter. And so what we helped do as part of their screening process to figure out if the applicants were actually would qualify as disadvantaged. So we did some analysis, and then we created a template for L4GG to use in the future when they do the screening process. And then the next 3 parts of our project correspond to our like 3 main deliverables. So I'll just talk about the deliverables. But in general, our aim was to kind of like disseminate the information we gathered in like as many different ways as possible to make it the most accessible. So the first thing we made were fact sheets. Basically, there is like a ton of information out there about federal funding and application processes and eligibility. And one of the barriers to people applying is to kind of like distill down the most important information. So we created kind of like short 1 to 2 page fact sheets with what we thought was the most relevant and useful information to help people figure out if they're eligible and also how to apply if they are. There were a few different types of fact sheets we made. So the first type was like an overview of federal funding type fact sheet. We made 2 of those just to help people kind of understand federal funding more broadly and figure out the different types of federal funding that are available and also in general how to apply. And then we made a community engagement fact sheet. This is specifically geared towards state and local governments and NGOs who might be working with communities. And we tried to kind of make a toolkit for like best practices to engage with communities. And then the last type, we identified 5 specific funding streams that we thought would be the most relevant for communities who are looking to apply for climate resilience funding. And we made fact sheets about eligibility and about how to apply. The next thing we did was we helped L4GG in a little bit of like a redesign of one of their web pages. So now all of the resources we made live on their federal funding resources webpage. And we also helped them reorganize it a little bit. Before it was organized like chronologically. Now it's organized topically to hopefully make it a little bit more useful as like a landing page for people who are looking to learn more about federal funding. And the last thing we did was have a webinar. So we had 42 people come to our webinar. There are people like from state and local governments, NGO representatives, and we basically went and talked through all of our resources. We talked a little bit about federal funding in general, and our aim was both to disseminate that information and also to get feedback about our resources. So I will turn it over to Rebecca to talk about that.
Yeah, so in terms of impacts, I'll start by talking about some of the feedback we got on the webinar. And so we did polling at the beginning and end of the webinar, and we found that participants' familiarity and understanding with the federal funding process increased over the course of the webinar, particularly amongst people who did not have prior experience. And I know this plot is a little bit confusing to read, but basically at the beginning and at the end, we asked people to rate their comfort or familiarity with federal funding on a scale of 0 to 5. And on average, people's self-reported scores increased by 1 point throughout the webinar. And there were greater increases amongst people who had no prior experience. So that's what we would hope to see, that this is sort of reaching the people who needed it most. We also wanted to understand in the webinar which topics people found most helpful, and the most common answers were how to find federal funding opportunities, as well as overviews of types of federal funding and how the federal funding process works, and that aligns really with where our resources focused. So it was good to see that the topics we were covering were relevant and useful for the participants of the webinar. And then we also wanted to understand what information might be missing and what people were interested in learning more about in order to guide L4GG's future work and resources they might develop. And so the number 1 answer there was more information about finding currently available federal funding opportunities. As Jared alluded to, the funding landscape is really dynamic and grant opportunities are changing all the time. And so we did gather some resources for sort of navigating that, but that's something that people are definitely interested in having more resources for, to sort of match opportunities with what they're working on. And then people were also interested in learning more about determining eligibility and developing community government partnerships. And then finally, just to zoom out a bit into sort of our theory of change for broader impact, the immediate impacts of our project were to reduce information gaps and help L4GG build capacity amongst community-based organizations and local governments in disadvantaged communities. And we hope that this information sharing and capacity building will translate into increased access to federal funding for climate resilience. And ultimately, the goal of increasing this equitable access to federal funding is to lead to more resilient communities and just and equitable governance. So I will end there. We want to thank our clients, Lauren and Jillian at L4GG, as well as our faculty advisor, Scott Tenbrink, of course, Jen and Bridget at Graham and the Dow Company. And we will open up for questions. We unfortunately didn't get to do any field trips, but.
Really great, thank you. Up on the left.
Hi guys, you did great. I have a quick question. I know the digital divide is still a pervasive issue, and not even the digital divide, just having worked with nonprofits, having issues with funding, they don't know where to start, they don't know where to look, what to Google. Did you address or discover other ways to disseminate this information that's not just centralized on their website?
Yeah, so L4GG is, because they're a dispersed organization that works really across the country, they are really interested in digital dissemination. But I think there are ways of distributing this throughout their network. So they have a really broad network of both pro bono lawyers, but also community organizations. And so I think the hope is that sharing, particularly the fact sheets, with community partners means that they can sort of share it out within their local networks. And I know, like, one of the people we worked with went to a conference of local sustainability leaders where she brought printouts of it. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of limited scope to digital information, but there's also hope that it will be distributed.
Black sweater.
Thank you guys, really wonderful presentation. I'm curious what you all kind of took away from the screening process of how you guys figured out like what would require people to be eligible, and if you learned anything from the organizations or the communities that you were able to kind of touch point with.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So L4GG actually developed a disadvantaged communities report, and it's pretty extensive because a big issue with this project that we didn't really, not the project, sorry, the overall issue that we didn't really address in the presentation is just limitations of what the federal government uses as their methods for distributing funding and for determining what is an eligible community, et cetera. It's extremely convoluted and complicated. So L4GG has done their best to develop a report to help communities who might be eligible for this type of climate resilience funding to better understand whether their community will specifically be eligible for a specific funding stream that they might be interested in. For their funding clinic, we developed a template that they can use to specifically identify for a specific community, for a specific funding stream, whether they will be eligible. But we didn't have an opportunity because mostly of time and capacity constraints to actually interact with like our team. L4GG interacts with their communities, but we as a team from the Dow Fellowship didn't really have an opportunity to interact directly with communities. So we were learning about this at a pretty high level. And there's just a lot of limitations in terms of the way the federal government sort of tries to address this. So I think that this is sort of an unsatisfactory answer, I think, because we don't really have a satisfactory solution to it right now. It's like a real issue that needs to be addressed. And in our report, we sort of call for, we're just like, we mentioned that the federal government really needs to have a systemic transformational change to address the gap between this funding and disadvantaged communities, because just providing it to the community or providing it out there and saying, this is for these communities without actually creating a stream for that obviously is not particularly effective. They recently have been addressing it through some projects, but yeah, it's a huge gap still. So.
How about this side of the room? Okay then, how about right in the middle?
Yeah, thank you all for the presentation. It's a really interesting project. I guess my question is, for the redesign of the website, was there actually like tracking happening beforehand that like the website wasn't being used as much? Like, how did you track? How do you know if like your redesign is actually impactful, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It was a little bit outside of our scope, but it is something that we've talked with our faculty advisor, who's at the School of Information, about doing as sort of a next step. So they, as far as we know, don't have a lot of website tracking, and they had all their information there, but we sort of, with our faculty advisor, went through a process of modeling what different potential users who come to the website might be looking for, and what would be the best way of sort of navigating the website to find those resources. So yeah, we don't have the tracking for it, but I think that's something we would definitely recommend to them in the future.
Yes.
Hi, great presentation. I have a really simple question, hopefully. Is that webinar available for any of us to watch if we'd like to?
It is, and there is a QR code that you can
Beautiful,
follow.
love it, thank you.
It's also on the website, which also has a QR code.
Okay, who else? Yes.
Okay, I'll just talk loud. Great job, guys. I'm curious on the webinar if you guys heard any maybe like broader comments from those who attended that this information was something they understood. Because I feel like with federal funding, it's awesome that we have all these things coming forward for climate action, but it's very complex, as you guys mentioned, and for marginalized communities, some of this is not even like basic, like they don't even understand some of this basic level stuff. So I'm just curious, like, as sustainability students in the room, like how did you guys make this information really tangible for them to understand something that's very complex, but is useful to them?
So we mostly relied on our client, L4GG, to basically determine what they sort of thought, based on conversations with us, what they thought would be the most accessible formats for our deliverables. They work closely with the communities, in their funding clinic, and so they have a better understanding of the landscape of the potential users of this information and these deliverables. So we had suggestions of best practices, from our learnings in school and our work about what we thought might be, most accessible, but really the decision at the end of the day was with our client because they have more expertise in this. So they felt that one-pagers, these fact sheets, would sort of be a good way to distribute, as we were sort of mentioning, like to distribute out through their networks of partners and get these down to the community level. And then they sort of felt like the webinar was a really good way to have this information in verbal format and video format in perpetuity, or available in perpetuity online. And so there needs to be more research done on specifically, I mean, obviously we would have loved to have provided like a 20-question survey, but there's just capacity constraints among community members or government employees who are on this webinar. So we sort of did what we could in terms of trying to understand the impact of these specific deliverables, but really we were relying on our clients' expertise with this. And I think they, as we are really interested in trying to determine if these are helpful and how we might want to change them moving forward, either with a different Dow project or with other partners they have in pro bono work for better accessibility.
Did you get any comments like on the webinar that this was like really straightforward or like super helpful and you were excited about it? I'm just curious.
Yeah, there was very brief time. A couple of people were like, "Oh, thanks, this was helpful," and that was actually very literally the extent of that. But basically, the feedback we got was in terms of the impact graphs we showed. Like that was actually all we have from this, just because of capacity constraints that our client very reasonably said. We based on their previous experience with webinars, saying like if we send out long surveys, we find that we don't really get responses back. And so we sent out a very short survey and tried to get impact information, but that was essentially it.
One more question?
Great presentation. I'm curious if you had conversations around the use of the money. It's one thing to get the grant and to successfully secure the grant. It's a whole other tangle of bureaucracy to figure out how to access that money once you've been awarded it. Did that come up in conversation or as part of maybe an extended scope of the work?
Yeah, I think that's not something that we were working on, but the client, a main part of their activity is this funding clinic, and the funding clinic partners with communities not only in obtaining the grants, but in a lot of those sort of legal technicalities that come along with implementing the grant and accessing the funding. So they do a lot of different types of work, but that may mean, if you're trying to bring in a solar array and work with a utility, there's a lot of contracts that have to be worked out. And so a lot of their sort of one-on-one work with clients, I think, is in that space. That's not something that we were able to touch with these more general resources, but I do think it's a really big issue. And one of the things we found in sort of researching barriers to communities and accessing this funding is exactly what you said. There's often a really high administrative burden, there's a really high reporting burden, and just maintaining that, especially with limited staffing capacity, is a real challenge. And so I think it goes back to sort of the recommendations or hope for the federal government to really rethink how it does some of these funding opportunities, is to sort of limit the barriers to actually using the funding once it's awarded.
Great. One more hand for Group 7.
Congratulations, fellows. I am so proud and inspired by all of you. You give me hope for the future. Can we give our fellows one more round of applause?